There's an army of IUL critics trolling the interwebs whose only ostensible objective is to denigrate the IUL and those who purvey it. Now, don't get me wrong, there's plenty to criticize on how the IUL is marketed on social media, and I've made plenty of videos on this channel debunking those approaches. But that's hardly the whole story when it comes to IUL. The real issue seems to be that the IUL's critics, almost to a person, tend to conflate scammy agents with scammy products. In other words, if an agent uses underhanded tactics when selling the IUL, the product itself is, by extension, a scam or a ripoff. This is somewhat akin to saying, because Jordan Belfort, the Wolf of Wall Street, used deceptive practices when selling stocks, then you should avoid stocks at all costs. Look, we're all adults here, and we should be able to distinguish between scammy people and scammy products. But when you get past all the shady marketing on TikTok and elsewhere, the IUL's critics still have one overwhelming objective: its purported high fees. The IUL's fees, they affirm, are its Achilles heel. Having studied how the IUL's fees work for the last 15 years of my career, I find this criticism puzzling. It's been employed by Susie Orman, Dave Ramsey, Clark Howard, Jeremy Schneider, Amit Sethi, and countless others. And the thing that's so confounding is that all these gurus are ostensibly smart people. They know how to read ledgers and they're good at math, yet they predictably and persistently list the IUL's fees as its weak spot. What I endeavor to show you in today's video is that IUL's fees are one of its very best features, particularly if you're committed to keeping it your entire life. Instead of being the IUL's Achilles heel, its fees are actually its strength. Fees are one of the reasons why you should consider making the IUL part of a balanced, comprehensive approach to tax-free retirement planning. So, exactly how high are the IUL's fees? I usually respond to that question the following way. They're a little bit higher in the early years, but they're much lower in the later years. Well, when you average them out over the life of the program, it can cost you as little as 0.5% per year. How can this be, you ask? Particularly when the fees in those early years can be perceived to be prohibitively high? Well, you have to understand how insurance companies structure the IUL's fees over the life of the program. Generally speaking, the IUL's fees are front-loaded. That means that insurance companies incur most of the expenses for getting your policy up and running in the first 10 to 15 years. But the truth is, after those first 10 to 15 years, the IUL's fees literally fall off a cliff. And all you're really left with in year 16 plus is the cost of annual renewable term insurance. And because the fees are so low in those later years, you'll find that given enough time, the average internal expenses of the policy diminish to an infinitesimally small amount. Before I get into a specific example, let me throw out a caveat. In order for you to experience the types of fees I'm about to show you, 3 things must be true. First, you must have a company with a strong rating who preferably guarantees their expenses. Second, you must structure the policy properly, meaning you must buy as little insurance as the IRS requires of you and stuff as much money into it as the IRS allows. And finally, you must continue to fund the policy properly over the prescribed funding period. To illustrate how an IUL's fees are structured, let's look at a policy on a 40-year-old male, best underwriting class, initial death benefit of $334,076, contributing $20,000 per year every year through age 65, and growing at 7% per year gross of fees. Okay, let's go to the policy expense page of the illustration to give you a sense for how the fees are structured. You'll notice that the main brunt of the fees are experienced in years 1 through 10 with a slight drop in years 11 through 15. But watch what happens in years 16 plus. You're left with the cost of annual renewable term insurance and the policy fee. So when I say that the IUL's fees are higher in the early years and much lower in the later years, this is exactly what I'm talking about. For example, take a look at the expenses as a percentage of your first year's contribution. This particular individual contributed $20,000 that first year and paid $3,502 in expenses. That means their first year expense ratio was 17.5%. Hardly a good deal, right? Well, now let's look at the expenses in the 25th year of the policy as a percentage of the cash value. The cash value is now $1,332,364, and the expenses are only $2,568. That represents about 0.2% of the cash value. In fact, if you look at the internal rate of return, which is the best indication of the policy's average expenses per year, you'll find that it's well below the 0.5% I mentioned at the outset of this video. That's lower than the least expensive 401k plans on the market. Let me put this differently. Entering into an IUL contract is a bit like getting married. You don't get married because you plan on being together for 5, 10, or even 15 years. You get married because it's till death do you part. So when evaluating the fees inside your IUL, you shouldn't fixate on the fees in the first 15 years. You should consider the fees as an average percentage of the cash value over the life of the policy. In short, the financial gurus build their anti-IUL narrative about the IUL's fees exclusively in the early years. If it's 17.5% of the first year's premium, it must be 17.5% of the actual cash value over the life of the program. This approach could not possibly be any more flawed. The reality is, the longer you hold a properly structured and funded IUL, the lower the average expenses per year. We're talking well below 0.5% per year. The IUL's critics default to this approach because they don't have the time or energy to fully evaluate the IUL's fees in a nuanced, comprehensive way. Because if they did, they'd see that the IUL's fees are not, in fact, a liability, they're its strength. And it should therefore be considered as an integral part of a balanced, comprehensive approach to tax-free retirement.